Hello, everyone. My name is Prateek Singh. I am the CEO and founder of LearnApp.com. If you want to learn trading, investing, or personal finance, then head on to LearnApp. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Zerodha Educate. You're in for a treat. To say this year has been a roller coaster ride for the markets would be an understatement. We saw a dramatic fall and an even dramatic recovery as all economic data indicated we were in serious trouble. So, we wanted to make sense of the disconnect between the real economy and the stock market and how investors should look at investing going forward. So I caught up with Anand Krishnan, the Chief Investment Officer of Franklin Templeton, India, in this absolutely brilliant and wide ranging conversation. You'll be surprised how well Anand explains the journey of what happens in an economy and the markets, and he even decodes major economic concerns for India and the globe. So please enjoy my conversation with Anand. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. We're going to talk about equity, that's macro. We're going to talk about markets. We're also going to talk about how investors should invest in the current times. And with us, we have Anand Radhakrishnan from Franklin Mutual Fund. I'm Prateek Singh. I'll be hosting today's session. I am the CEO of LearnApp. So if you want to learn anything about investing or trading, head on to learnup.com. It's the only place you can actually learn properly. So first, we're going to start and get some information from the macroeconomic side. My first question to Anand is going to be, what's your reading of the Indian economic situation right now? I mean, are we in trouble, and what are the probable scenarios that you see playing out in the future?
Thanks, Pratik, for having me here. And there are two ways to look at the current economic scenario. One is the medium-term, long-term, medium-term trend. Another one is a shorter-term situation. If you really look at it from a very, very short period of time, yes, we are in trouble. We have gone through a meaningful shrinkage, fall in economic activity, if you may call it so. Whether in an economy, typically there are two or three kinds of broad activities. One is people buy and sell things. We call it consumption. And then people invest, create large projects, infrastructure, and other capital expenditure kind of spending. We call it as an investment spending. And then there is a third thing called government, which again spends money on economic, social activities. So we call it, so these are three pillars of an economy: consumption, investment, and government. We have seen meaningful shrinkage in both consumption, not necessarily on staples. Staples are things which are needed for your day-to-day living.
Right.
We haven't seen a big fall in consumption of that, but discretionary. That is where people can postpone their spending. For example, if you want to buy a car, do you want it today or do you want it tomorrow? You can decide that you can want it tomorrow. Or you want to buy a home. Do you want it now or you want it after a month or so? So that things are called discretionary consumption. Whereas what you want today, like a soap, shampoo, or biscuit, or noodles, or anything that is required for today's sustenance is called staples. So staples have not shrunk within consumption, but it is a discretionary part of consumption which has taken a big knock. Similarly, on the investment side, there are two kinds of investments. People buy homes, which is a big investment per se, which is again taken a knock. Whereas a government building infrastructure is also an investment which has not taken a big knock in the current situation. So there are, again, I would say the cup is half empty there and half full in investment as well. So if you look at it, therefore, it's not as if the entire economic activity has gone for a toss. Right. There are aspects of economy which are economic engine, which are still running. And I think once the COVID-related uncertainties slowly fade, or there is a medical solution that is found, some of the discretionary aspects of the economic activity will come back pretty strong. So the short-term situation is that it is impacted by COVID and it will therefore bounce back. But if you really ask me where the real challenges are, it is actually in the medium to longer term. India is rediscovering its own economic situation within the world. which was dominated by, on one side, Western economies like US, and on the other side, emerging economies like China. India's place was somewhere forgotten, and it had not exercised itself as a very big economic power. But I think that big challenge for India will be on the medium to longer term is to get its rightful place in terms of economic position and power within the global economic scenario. It can be through higher exports from India, both services exports as well as manufacturing exports. It can be more inventions, more spending on R&D. There are various ways India can, come into an economic highlight within the global scenario. I think there we have long way to go, both in terms of doing things right, building the pillars better, and making the business ease of doing businesses better, deregulating many industries, and those kind of challenges are still there. So my short answer to your question, therefore, is cyclical challenges will get addressed over the next 3-4 quarters, whereas structurally, economically, we need to do a lot more.
Right, that makes sense. You said something about consumption taking a hit in the shorter term, right? Especially for discretionary spends. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, a lot of people have talked about the government and RBI doing stuff for liquidity, actually, there's plenty of liquidity, but doing stuff for stimulus, as they say. What's your take on this? A lot of debate around, has RBI actually done enough? So, in the simplest layman terms, have we really done enough to support the economy? Has the RBI done enough? And do we have enough money to steer out of the economy in case there is another dip, assuming something goes wrong over, say, the medium or short term?
So when you talk about stimulus, there are two broad kind of stimulus. One is called monetary stimulus. Another one is called fiscal stimulus. Monetary stimulus is very easy to understand because it is the availability of money and the cost of money. We call it credit availability and credit costs, which in any economy, any borrower will be subject to. For a very long time, India was running a very high interest rate regime because of high inflation. There are inefficiencies, not too many lenders, too many borrowers, too fewer lenders. So entire bargaining power was with the lending system. Even now it is like that, but it is improving. So because of that, everyone had to borrow at very high interest rates. But now I think over the last 2 years, what we have seen is that there is a marked shift between in the central bank's approach towards stimulating the economy monetarily. From an extremely tight situation, they have become very accommodative, as we call it, accommodative. Accommodative means they want to create more credit growth, and they want to also bring down the cost of borrowing money for people, because one of the big thing India is struggling with is its exorbitant cost of borrowing when compared to other emerging markets. In developed economies, if you want to buy a home, you will get at a very low interest rate, 3%, 3.5%. Now, I don't know the current rates, but probably it's pretty low, even lower than that. Whereas in India, even today, if you want to buy a mortgage, borrow a mortgage loan, it is around 8.25%. So there is a 5% difference between borrowing cost in India versus in, let's say, in China or in US, etc. The benefit of a very low interest cost is that you can afford bigger things, better things. If for the same amount of monthly EMI, you can buy a better car or a better home if interest rates are half. So for example, your ability to pay an EMI, monthly EMI is 10,000 rupees.
Sure.
If the interest rates are 10%, you may be able to afford only let's say, 3 lakh rupees car, whereas the interest rate is 5%, you may be able to afford a 6 lakh rupees car or a 7 lakh
consumption also goes up. That's right.
So the quality of consumption goes up, the volume of consumption goes up, and instead of buying one thing, people may buy two because cost of borrowing is half. So these are very important for an economy to run well. So we call it, again, in technical jargon, real interest rates. That is nominal rates minus inflation. If real rates are very high, it is very tough for borrowers. That means that the inflation is not compensating for the cost of borrowing enough. So many economies now, the real interest rates have gone negative. For India also, it is now going gradually towards negative. I think that is very important, that real cost of borrowing has to be low. So the monetary part of the stimulus is beginning to work. But again, there are a lot of challenges. Banks and the financial institutions are still not able to pass on the benefits fully well to the borrowers per se. But we have a long way to go there. But I think directionally we are doing fine. It's the other stimulus is where we have a challenge. It's a fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus is essentially what government gives. There are two ways you can stimulate an economy fiscally. One is put money in the hands of people, more money. The only way you can put more money in the hands of people is to cut taxes. What the money that government is taking from the people, you
Reduced.
don't take it. You give it back to them in the form of tax cuts. Now, like if you in US, if you have seen, there were a lot of tax cuts. Even in India, we have seen corporate rate
Corporate
tax cut
tax.
last year. So that is one methodology. The other method is government spending a lot of money, run a big deficit. They borrow from future, they borrow more money and spend on things that they think will create a lot of impact in the economy and create jobs, etc. So either you give money in the hands of people or you yourself spend that money. I think in neither of these cases, I think India has done that bigger job. If you look at the stimulus package, which is given 80-90% of the stimulus package is monetary stimulus.
Correct.
Only 10% of the package is fiscal stimulus. So I think at some point, Indian government will have to put more money in the hands of people. Maybe that will involve a little bit of shrinkage of government's own monetary base or their own spending. But if they do that, like cut in GST or cut in personal income taxes, giving more tax benefits for if you want to buy a home. Currently, let's say government gives you certain annual tax deductions, it can give more, right? If instead of giving 2 lakh rupees deductible against your income, I can give you 4 lakh rupees annual deduction, and then it becomes cheaper for you to buy a home. So there are many number of ways government can stimulate the economy. As of now, I think it is slightly below expectations what they are doing.
So that was a really nice explanation, Anand. I thought you will give a 1-2 line explanation of whether they did well or not, but you went really step by step explaining what this is, and super, super nice. So going back to the first part, when you talked about real interest rates becoming negative, right? So another way that could happen is that inflation could actually increase, right? Now,
Yes.
If you look at post 2008, everyone loves doing this back analysis, right? But it never happens. But I have to ask this question. So 2008, after the crash happened and the recovery happened, we had inflation going up. What do you what do you think is going to happen this time? Do you think inflation would go up, or if it would not, what would the reasons that it would stay depressed? I mean, what's your view here?
It's an interesting question. Again, inflation has two big drivers, globally speaking. One is called manufacturing inflation, and the other one is called services inflation. So manufacturing inflation is when something is in short supply. The price of those goods go up. I think truly and genuinely, manufacturing inflation has died a long time back globally. It is an era of abundance. There are abundant amount of natural resources, and there are more efficient way of using natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the commodity prices are not going up that well. There is abundant capacity in cars, steel, computers, etc. So I think truly and speaking, the inflation on the manufactured goods, industrial goods, is a thing of the past. And the world is learning to manufacture these things more efficiently also with less
Resources.
material. less resource intensive. Cars are becoming more fuel efficient, means you are going to burn less oil.
Right.
Similarly, if you are using less steel in construction, the demand for steel also gets moderated. So
Interesting.
people are getting more efficient in the way they utilize these things, and there is also reasonable capacity globally on most goods. So I don't see, therefore, there is a huge risk of manufacturing inflation. And then there are second kind of risk is what is called services inflation, which is predominantly manpower related. For example, if there is a shortage of teachers in an economy,
Yeah.
the price of their services will go up. Like what you are doing, a learning app, is actually you are essentially disrupting the teachers market. In the sense you are automating it, you are bringing technology to it, you are putting it on a platform, which means, what if there is a shortage of teacher, there is a way to uh, compensate for it. There is a way to leverage technology to play that game. Like that, in everywhere, there is a bit of automation is happening, and therefore reducing the pressure on wages as well. For example, in US has been in full employment for a long time. Despite this COVID thing, again, the employment is slowly improving.
Right.
But pre-COVID, US was near full employment, but wages never went up. The reason was that there was innovative ways in which companies and businesses were figuring out to get more out of people, and also not ensure that doesn't come at a very high cost, kind of a thing. So again, therefore, there are various pushes and pulls to the argument, but the thing is, the wage inflation is also pretty moderate globally. So if you really ask me, global outlook for inflation is extremely benign, and therefore one can foresee for a long period of time interest rates also to remain benign.
That was a really cool link you made between scale, technology, and efficiency being an enemy to inflation. So I think that was really really cool. Let's move on to markets now, Anand, shall we? I started trading when I was 17, which is a while back. And back then, I realized the news, reading something, the actual economy, and the market can be completely different things. So
It
here's
still
my
is.
still is. Here's my question. The pandemic's getting worse. I hate it when the news keeps adding total number of cases because to me it makes no sense. You have to track active cases and not total cases, just nonsense. But anyway, the pandemic's getting quote unquote worse. And the markets don't seem to care. The US markets are an all time high. India is also going up. What's the link between the economy and the markets, Anand?
Yeah, there is two ways. I mean, in classic theory of valuing the markets, it is nothing but discounted value of all the future cash flows of the market. Okay, let me explain it with this, probably a company. It's easier to understand.
Sure.
See, if you want to value a company, it is nothing but financial security. It is nothing but all the future cash flows you get out of that security, and then you kind of bring it back in time to today's value. We call it as the net present value of all future cash flows. Just to kind of explain, if you get 100 rupees today, and if I tell you that you have a choice to get 100 today, or you have a choice to get 100 1 year later, which one would you prefer? So you would say, listen, I would like to have 100 now. But if you have to give it to me 1 year later, I would like to have 105 or 108, because you are foregoing having that 100 today. We call it like, time value for money. So what are the things that you are going to get over a period of time is called cash flows. And when you are going to get it is called time period. So we bring it back to the current situation. That how do we bring it back is by discounting it. That is, we call it like, for 1 year, if you want me not to have this money, you got to give me 5 rupees more. For 2 years, if you want to give it not to have this money, you have to give me 10 or 12 rupees more, kind of a thing. So that is called discounting factor. Now, because of the fall in the global interest rates, this discounting factor, this expected return has also fallen. So even if you tell me the same amount of money is available, today it is worth more, same amount of cash flow is available, but your discounting factors have reduced a lot. I think that is what is the single biggest factor that has driven the market up, is that market is saying that the interest rates are going to remain low. If the interest rates are going to remain low for long periods of time, same cash flows are getting discounted more, or the value of that cash flows have become more. That is the one way of looking at it. The other way is, even if the cash flows fall, the discount rate is compensating for it. Fall in discount rate is compensating for it. So it's a pushes and pull of maybe a moderating cash flow on the top line, whereas a falling interest rate on the bottom, denominator versus numerator, is what is creating the market. So that is a technical way of understanding the why the markets are trading at higher valuation, is the cost of money has really dropped because of excessive liquidity being pumped into the market. The second thing is another way to understand it is that every passing month is also taking us closer to finding a solution technically. I mean, the
So
medically there
optimism
will be a
increases time
progress.
with time.
Yeah, because let's say by mid of next year, there is an expected time by which vaccine will come. Some vaccine will come, and many companies are working on it. I'm sure few of them will be moderately successful. So every passing month takes you closer to a solution. And that is giving market more confidence that, if there is a solution, what happens? Therefore, you don't want to miss out on a fallen stock price for a very short, for a challenge which is going to be there for, let's say, a year. But at the end of a year, there's going to be a solution. So I want to play that.
Yeah.
So many investors are also saying that I will do this. I will wait it out for maybe for a year. Maybe there is a vaccine trade available there, and that vaccine will make me rich as well, because I'm buying things when they are low.
Yeah.
They're not, vaccine is not only going to cure people, it is also going to make so that is a trade which market is trying to play, and of course it has played it quite well now. And I think these are the two reasons why the market, one is a fall in interest rates and therefore falling in discounting rate, and second is passing month takes you closer, potentially closer to a finding a solution.
This also tells us, Anand, of how optimistic everyone work from home. They're sitting at home. There's no travel. There's no boss. There's no attendance, and they're saying, I've got some money. What should I do? I should probably invest. And I think India's optimistic, right? I think that's what it shows.
I think many of you might have heard about this Robinhood traders, right? Or
yes,
people who have, suddenly there's a large retail traders have come into the market. Traders, investors, whatever you call it. The reason is, I think that is the silver lining to the cloud, and otherwise the dark cloud people have been sitting at home. So yeah, you have a platform, you have access to information, you have time.
Correct.
And then all you need is to crunch it a little bit, and there is a trade available. So clearly, I think markets, of course, have been providing the much needed optimism.
That's
to
right.
an otherwise a very challenging circumstance. The real economy is very challenging. I think work is challenging, careers are challenging.
Correct.
But I think some part of market is, of course, giving that optimism.
I mean,
but yeah, to kind of answer your other question is, yes, it is not easy, but I think people are getting used to it. People are finding ways to use it. I think the boom in some of the online classes and courses is an indication that people are trying to relearn things, increase their skills, and improve their knowledge quotient, etc. So there are ways in which people are coping up with this.
I mean, it's amazing how the economy has changed, because corporate India is wearing a shirt on top and Bermuda's down there, and it's caused the entire market to go up. I'm
not getting up. I'm just going to keep remaining sitting now.
Hilarious. So, I mean, we're also part of the online learning boom, right? Especially investing because of LearnApp. And what's happened is that previously, pre-corona, people used to ask this question, should I invest in the market? Now they say, Prateek, the Nifty PE is now at 31, which is
Yeah.
sort of an advanced question. And they say that's very high. So that's my next question. Nifty PE is at 31. That is an all-time high. I think the highest was 32 or 33, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I also know that there was an Franklin FT Perspective stock you mentioned that loss-making companies in the index seem to be pushing up the P number. What does that mean? And how should a retail investor look at these hot, high valuations right now?
So yeah, index P is let's say if you do Nifty, it is a weighted average P of 50 companies.
Yes.
So there are big companies, there are medium-sized companies, there are profit-making companies, there are loss-making companies, or not so high profit-making companies within Nifty. For example, if you take a financial stock, maybe its profits are low currently. A bank, public sector bank, if you take it, its P profit will be very low and PE will be very high. But that is not the way in which it is valued. It is valued not purely on PE basis. It is valued on a price to book basis. Okay. Similarly, if you look at even a company like Reliance, it is no longer trading on a PE basis. It is based on some of the parts of various businesses. So it has an oil business, it has a telecom business, it has a retail business. And telecom and retail doesn't make that much money as of now, but they are trading on strategic value basis based on the valuation in which the investors have come into that company. So yes, PE is a good measure. It's a quick and dirty way of understanding a business. It is efficient. It is democratic in the sense everyone will be able to access it. Therefore, it is not too technical, but it doesn't fully capture the picture per se. Whenever the company is going through, let's say, earnings challenge, profit challenge. Like in the first quarter, many companies, retail companies declared losses. How do you value them on a PE? If someone is making losses,
it is negative, correct?
Yeah, it is negative, etc. So there's no way technically it should trade at zero, but it doesn't trade at zero.
By those standards, startups could never be valued. So, but yes.
Yeah, some of those companies are still earnings challenged, like Tata Motors, etc.
Right.
So yeah, so therefore that average is what would lead to confusion. But there are within Nifty very moderately valued companies, and there are very expensively, or from a PE perspective, what may look like an optically very expensive number. Now that is, I explained there are reasons why it may look expensive, but then genuinely again there are companies that are trading expensive. For example, if you take some of the consumer staple companies like Hindustan Unilever, or Asian Paints, etc. When I say expensive, means they trade at a PE higher than what they normally used to trade over the last 10 years or 15 years. So it is not normal. What they are trading at is a new high in terms of valuation. So if somebody says Hindustan Unilever is trading at 50 PE, let's say, I'm just giving an example, its 10-year average might be 25 or 30 or something like that. I'm just giving, or in Asian Paints or something. So in relation to its past, it is trading very expensive, and which is true. Now, the logic for that is people during times of uncertainty prefer stability and certainty.
Right.
And that is why they're willing to pay more for that. So if you don't want to take excessive volatility and you want to pay for stability, you say like, listen, I'm happy with, I don't mind paying some premium pricing for this. And that is what has worked for the last 1.5, 2 years, is that when economic uncertainty is kept going, I mean, even pre-COVID, the economic growth was going down. So how did people handle that situation is shifting to sectors which were not getting impacted by the economic slowdown. So it is maybe consumer staples. Later on, it became healthcare. Some of the pharma names also got re-rated. Nowadays, it is technology. Not only in India, globally, we are seeing many tech companies hitting new highs. The reason is people think that this is stability, this is where growth is, so I'm willing to be on that bus. I don't mind paying a premium ticket price for that, for boarding that bus. But the thing, the mind of the market today is that I want to be where the growth is. So I'm willing to pay premium. That is one way of looking at it. Second way of looking at the high PE stocks is, they are, some of them are disruptors. They are challenging the traditional businesses, where traditional ways of doing business. For example, an online retailer challenges an offline retailer. A modern retailing company challenges a kirana shop. Like that, there are n number of an online movie watching platform portal challenges theater chains. So what happens is there is these people are saying this is a disrupting business. This is going to meaningfully take away the market share from something else. I want to, and currently it may not have earnings, but this is where maximum growth will happen over the next decade or so, and I want to be there.
Right.
Kind of a thing. So it is technically, this is thematic investing. This is not based on pure valuations alone. And this thematic investing is what is gaining more and more flavor and momentum, and many of the retail as well as institutional investors do follow that very actively.
Correct. I mean, talking about themes, it's interesting that financials, like you said, did well. Pharma, also you found some leaders. Do you think that the leadership mix could change over the next 1 or 2 years? What do you think is going to happen there?
So there are, we call it rotation, sector rotations, etc. Sectors do rotate. What was a darling at one point of time becomes untouchable in another part of time. For example, NBFCs were a darling for the market, since till 2018, till the ILFS crisis happened. And then the whole thing kind of, blew off a bit, kind of a thing. Whereas healthcare was a anathema. Nobody wanted to touch any of the pharma stocks because, they were getting a lot of US FDA warning letters, import alerts, and everyone is having challenge. So till 2018, it was the most hated sector, whereas NBFC was most loved. And then 19 and 20, it entirely inverted.
Correct.
So, and similar is with IT, and maybe it will soon be with automobiles or something like that. We don't, so it is, sector rotation is one way to play a game. Currently, the most hated sector in the market is, let's say, financials, banks. No one wants to own a bank, or people are worried about owning a bank because people are fearing that there's going to be NPA. There is a Supreme Court that is monitoring banks, and they are putting all kinds of restrictions on banks, recognizing NPA, how much interest you can charge, or can you charge interest on interest, all that kind of thing, Supreme Court. So it is going through a period of derating because of COVID-related uncertainties. So we do think that once these uncertainties die off, it will come back again. But you need to play this sector rotation if you want to play carefully and in a very calculated manner. That is one way, that is a cyclical way of playing the market sector after sector. Then there is a structural way where you find these business disruptors, steady compounding companies which are growing at good pace irrespective of good or bad times. And then you have some good exposure as well. Again, there is no one particular way normally investors choose. Investors do mix and match of these styles. And you have to know exactly what you are playing for. And then that would kind of crystallize your investment thought on an idea.
That's interesting. So my next question was going to be around this, right? And the next section is on just investors. I always felt like if you look from 2000, whatever, 2007 or 2000 till now, you will always see turbulent times. It's only when you look back, it feels, oh, that was fine. It's turbulent and uncertain now, but that's completely not true, right? It was always uncertainty if you're looking for it. So now, again, people feel that these are the most uncertain times, et cetera, et cetera. How should a retail investor look to build his own portfolio that can survive through any of these times? You talked about consistent compounders and a little bit about diversification. So can you just rephrase that a little bit for the new investor?
Okay, let me make it simple. You know, sometimes people wonder why do I am coming to you guys, professional investors, when you are buying HDFC Bank.
Yeah.
What's the big deal? I can myself can buy.
True.
Why should I pay you a small fee for buying it? The thing is, it is not about buying, let's say, well-known companies like Hindustan Lever, HDFC Bank, or and then getting charged for it. No, it is a right balance of mix of compounding ideas and contrarian ideas.
Hmm.
Early growth versus medium, middle growth, or mature growth companies. How do you value them? And therefore create a portfolio which is a good mix of young Turks as well as seasoned campaigners. And a guy who has got a lot of enthu and risk taking versus a person who is more mature and more balanced. The portfolio is not only a sector diversification exercise, it is about uh, the age of companies diversification, the nature of companies diversification, the nature of businesses diversification, etc. So anybody who is trying to analyze any company should understand the role of that company in your portfolio. You are not expecting something to become multi-bagger. You are expecting them to be steady compounders.
Right.
Whereas another bunch of stocks, you are willing to take a risk because you think that, but you are not going to bet your house on them,
Right.
because if that doesn't happen, then your money goes. So the framework is wherever you see risks or risk in outcomes, you need to size your bets very carefully. Where the risks in outcomes are more narrower, you can increase your bet size. That's the thumb rule most investors follow. And it's very important for people to understand. Sometimes people say, I found this multi-bagger. I made 10 times money on this company. Then when I ask, how much money did you invest of your own 100? Then they would say, I would have invested 1% of my net worth. So 1% became 10% of your net worth. Whereas if you invested 2%, it would have become 20. If it would have become 3, it would have become 30. Even a 3% bet would have meaningfully improved your net worth. Whereas, so it is not how many times the money went up alone that matters. How many times the bet went up, how much you bet on it also is very important. I think bet sizing is very least understood, again, an idea within investors. And again, people have to have those buckets. You bucket saying that this is a risk where I am willing to take it little more higher. Yep. So portfolio managers tend to intuitively build all these things in their portfolio and give that balanced thing to the investors. So yeah, during volatile times, the approach should be to keep buying or buy more if you can, and then wait it out. Again, what you mentioned about when you're going through it, it looks like a big thing, but when you look at it in retrospective, the market chart looks very nice, kind of a thing. And that is again this classic thing of distance brings you objectivity. You got to remove yourself a little bit away.
Right.
If you're a day in day out market trader, it is very tough.
Yes.
It is very, very tough. That's why sometimes simple investors make more money than more complex traders. That's another irony of the market. I think even many mutual fund investors also are like that. But increasingly, I think the proportion is gradually only increasing. I'm not saying people
Right.
still trade. Even today, the average tenure of investors staying in a mutual fund is only 3 years, equity mutual fund, which is not very high. Considering that there are 30-year people who hold shares for 20, 30 years, whereas equity mutual fund, they want to own only for 3 years max or
Exactly.
4 years kind of a thing.
We have a very young office, right? So everyone in office is extremely young, right? So below
Yeah.
25 or so. And not me, I'm older, but people over here. And I realized that all of them say, hey, should I buy a land and wait it out for 20 years? And these are kids saying this. Or can I just invest for 6 months in the stock market and get a return?
Yeah.
So I think, it's just I think there's some cultural influence on asset class timing and how long you're supposed to hold it.
I think it is almost like, it is like equity means it has to make a lot more money and a lot faster kind of a thing. And there's innate expectations of investors on that.
I,
Fair enough. I think that is equities do tend to give better returns over longer periods of time, but it also gives a lot of volatility. So it's a very careful game people have to play.
Also because the information, like you said, you can see it, right? I can't see the land price change on a minute to minute basis. So I just don't care. And to find the land price requires so much of effort, you just forget about it.
Yeah, that is a I call that is a paradox in in quantum physics called Schrodinger's cat.
Yes.
You don't know whether it is, if you keep watch, if you observe it, it may die,
Yes.
kind of a thing. So if you keep observing things, they may look more volatile. So the less you observe, the volatility, actually, if you observe stock prices once in a quarter, they may not look as volatile. Whereas if you start watching them daily basis or minute by minute basis, the volatility gets amplified, and you start feeling that. So in the case of land prices, for example, or home prices, you don't get ready quotes on a daily basis or a hourly basis. So you are resigned to a particular valuation in your mind. I have bought it at, let's say, 30 lakh rupees or 40 lakh rupees is apartment, and I'll keep evaluating what is the value of it once in a year,
Right.
over the next 5-7 years as well. So you're not measuring it on a daily basis, weekly basis, because there is no price available. Sheer availability of price in a
That's
daily
everything.
basis messes up the mind of people. So that is a very crazy thing about equities, is that
Absolutely.
it is liquid, it is available on tap, and
Yes.
at every point of time, there is a buyer and a seller. And it is a good thing as well as it is also a bad thing.
Horrible thing. throw your phones out, delete those apps now. So we talked about land, that's interesting. We talked about equity. I got to talk about something, right? It's gold. So tell us, recently gold has performed very well. I personally never liked it as an asset class. I shouldn't be saying this, especially on a podcast, but I should be honest. And I think when I got married, there's tons of gold given, and it's not gold, it's jewelry. And I was completely against the idea. Now, not so much, I'm thinking, wow, how nice. So tell us about gold. The audience knows that in times of recession, the first place people go is flight to safety. So I know Franklin also doesn't have a gold scheme. So you'll be sort of unbiased. So tell us about gold as an asset class and the recent performance.
First, I'm an equity fund manager, so my view on gold will be you have to take it with a pinch of salt, not pinch of gold, pinch of salt. But the thing about gold is, yeah, it has a certain amount of finite supply on an annual basis, and generally it is viewed as there are two uses for financial investors for gold. Third use I will give for specific to the Indian investors. One is that it is a fear investment. This thing, when there is a fear, flight to safety means people move money from risky assets to less risky assets. So every time, whether it is a global financial crisis or COVID or things like that, some part of the money which was dabbling in risky assets moved to less risky assets, and gold is viewed as less risky assets. So perception of risk determines the prices of less risky assets, and gold being that is one trade. The second trade is, unlike fiat currencies of central banks, which is available in abundance, and banks and governments create more and more currency supply, gold is available in finite sum. So what they say is that whenever the world central banks and government tend to do this monetary stimulus, printing currencies, dropping interest rates, the value of the currencies goes down. The value of the dollar goes down. The value of rupee goes down. If Indian government spends a lot of money, but it doesn't have the money, so it creates that money. That means the value of the rupee goes down. Goes down against what? Against, let's say, another country which is not doing it. Against the currency of another country. Let's say, for example, our nearest country, let's say, is Sri Lanka or something like that. If Sri Lanka government doesn't print currency and Indian government prints a lot of Indian rupee, then Indian rupee versus Sri Lankan rupee, the value will change against the Indian rupee. So, but similarly, if you put gold on the other side, if you print a lot of currency, the value of gold will go up. So that because there is simply more money available, and the value of that money against a comparable another asset is less. And therefore, these are the two reasons. One is the fear factor, and the other one is excess excess monetization. We call it as global excess liquidity in the system. More specifically to India, India used to run a very high inflation, high interest rate environment. So currency used to depreciate. There is a theory in financial markets that if you run high interest rate economy versus another economy, your currency will depreciate against that economy. It's called interest rate parity theory. So if because then people will arbitrage. If the currency don't depreciate, then people can bring the money, get high interest rates, take it out, and borrow money from there, invest there, and make money very freely. That is called interest rate arbitrage. To avoid that, prevent that arbitrage, the currency will depreciate. India was having this problem. Currency used to always depreciate. I mean, when I started my career, currency was at 23 rupees or 22 rupees. Today it is at wherever it is, 73 rupees. So gold is not manufactured in India. So if you want to protect yourself against Indian inflation and Indian high interest rates, the one way people started realizing is gold protects, gives you a hedge, because rupee will depreciate and gold is denominated in dollars. So rupee value of gold will increase. So if you per gram of gold then versus now, if you look at it, the real increase would have been, most of it would have been because of rupee depreciation against dollar. For the last 25 years, if you understand the rupee compounding of gold, 60-70% of the compounding returns would have come out of depreciation of Indian rupee against dollar. Another 30-40% only would have come from real movement of gold. So these are the three reasons. Third reason is only specific to Indian investors.
You say you're equity CIO, but that was a masterclass in gold. That was very interesting. Anand, why don't we move to something about you personally? So how do you invest personally, and what is your investing philosophy?
So I've been only investing in mutual funds for more than only mutual funds for more than 16 years now. Before that, I used to have some stocks, but I stopped buying stocks directly. I've been from very 100% equity funds. I have more balanced with age. I have moderated with about 60% of my exposure is equities versus 40 on other asset classes. And so that is my, over a period of time, one adjustment is made is, proportion of equity has moderated a bit from what I save and from where I started, etc. The second thing is earlier I used to do a systematic saving, but nowadays I do more lump sum savings, etc. When I was younger, I was doing slightly more systematic ones. Nowadays, I find some opportunity and then I wait and then I accumulate money and then I invest. I know it is slightly against what we normally prescribe to other investors, but that is for people who don't have time, who don't have to manage things. Yeah. We say that just to make it a habit. And then once you make it as a habit, a small amounts, it kind of slowly snowballs and they won't even realize that. And third is you invest the money in the funds you manage, your team manages. That means it is like eating in the restaurant that you run.
But do you actually do you invest in your own funds that you manage?
Yeah, most of
is that a normal practice for the mutual fund industry, or is it rare? Like, what do you think?
I think most fund managers would be following it.
That's good.
They will be backing themselves up.
That's good, actually. That's very nice. And is this public information of how much? I'm sorry if I'm asking this question. Like,
it is available. It is annually disclosed, I think.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, that's perfect. All right. And can you tell me 2 investing lessons that you've learned over your career? I know it's difficult to zero down on just 2, but can you think of 2 major ones?
Yeah, one is a very easy one is that, if you don't understand, keep away, which is actually, though it is easy to say, it is tough to follow. Yeah. Many times, even as professional investors, sometimes we buy or invest in companies, businesses that we don't understand it that well. For retail investors, it's even tougher because their understanding of business would be lesser because they don't do it as their career. So, but many times I have seen that the businesses that you don't understand or where you are most likely to lose money, not because not be, whenever you analyze where you have lost money, you know that it is because you haven't understood that business. The reason is many businesses are volatile, but when something goes down, only in businesses that you understand, you will buy more.
Right.
Businesses that you don't understand, you will panic. You may sell it off. It may recover also, but you will not have the confidence to hold on. The confidence to hold on to a business during tough times comes from the understanding that business. If you
Right.
don't understand, you will buy when things are good and you will sell it off when things have become bad.
No compounding. Yeah.
So it becomes a cyclical behavior.
Yeah.
And to avoid it, only get into that you understand reasonably. That is the simple thing to follow. And I think if people follow that diligently, you can avoid egregious mistakes. The second thing is a comparison. That is again, this is a very tricky subject. One business is doing well, that stock has already done well. Then you'll find you might have missed it because you may not have identified it early. Someone else would have identified and the stock has done very well. Then what you do is you find its poor cousin in the market, something which looks like that, smaller than that, but it is saying, I am also going to become like that. Now, this is called relative value trade. We call it. You look at that, and you end up by you are looking at something very nice, but you are buying something else, saying that this also is going to become as good or as successful an investment
As
as
the
the other
larger
one,
one. But its
as the
growth
larger
will
one.
be faster because it's smaller.
Yeah, it's smaller, and now that there is a business model is established, it is only a question of following it, kind of a thing. But I would say it's a tricky thing because for every one idea that works like that, two will not work.
Hmm.
If you buy, let's say, a good jewelry company like Titan, and you will make money. But because Titan is now grown bigger, you want to buy another jewelry company, and that is not grown at all. In fact, you might have lost money in that company.
Yeah.
So looking at a good company, if you either buy a very good company, or you understand the one which you are buying very well. There is no easy way of saying that this is made money, that means this will also make money. This I understood very early in one of those tech boom days when all the Infosys and Wipro was all going up.
All tech companies are
And
now
I
big
was not
companies.
having enough of them. And then I said, like, listen, the only way I can do catch up is to buy some XYZ name. And I ended up burning my hand saying that because it was never as good as the bigger ones.
Yeah.
Or in fact, it failed as a company. So yes, there is a risk of playing this relative value trade. So if it is like if you like a car, good car, you buy it. If you buy a cheaper car, it will not be as good as that other car. You have to understand that this cheaper car is not going to become like, very unlikely it will become like that. You may fit with better audio equipment, you may fit more inside a TV, etc., but it will be not as good as a better quality car it is. So we need to understand this quality differences between companies, and there are many cases this quality doesn't get bridged very easily.
Hmm.
There are many. That is a big lesson I learned over a period of time. Of course, it's tough to follow every time.
Sure.
For example, if a bank has done well, you end up buying another bank which is saying that it's also going to do well. But it's always a struggle.
Correct. Yeah, I think what you said was the biggest variable over here is that investing has so many variables, so many things can go wrong. The management could go wrong, right? The processes could be incorrect, and that's why either you learn or you just get really good managers to invest your money.
Yeah, investing is also fun. I don't want to take the fun aspect of it away. You learn a lot of new businesses. For example, I didn't know anything about, let's say, Netflix 5 years back. Today, I know what its business is, how it is making money, etc. So there's always something new to learn, something new to follow, something new to invest in, and I think that's a big upside of tracking markets and tracking companies on your own. even though you may not be a professional investor, but that should not prevent anyone from understanding new businesses that are coming up, good business ideas that are working well in the market, and it is fantastic to learn about them.
So I guess
And that's why
going.
learning platforms like you should help people.
Thank you. And before we leave, any book you'd like to recommend, investing book that you like?
Experience is the best book, if you really ask me. There are um, uh, enough books available. I think in the modern days, I think Talib's books are eye-openers.
Right.
Nicholas Nassim Talib's books, eye-openers in understanding risks better, in understanding the kind of dynamics that are working in the market better. So that is if you are a macro guy, market person, you can read Taleb kind of
Not an
authors
easy read, though, but yes.
not an easy read, but yeah, but it is the best of the lot in the recent times, at least I have read. It's been there for some time now. For example, if you want to understand why certain companies are not as fragile as some other companies,
Right.
I would recommend that book, Anti-Fragility, to understand that. Whereas if you are not interested in that, whereas you want to understand businesses, how to pick stocks early,
Right.
then you have to go back all the way to Peter Lynch's books and figure out here because he's explained the best way to buy stocks. He used to kind of
go
do
and
market research, see things,
yeah.
and do it yourself. And I know even today it works.
It does.
Yes, it works definitely. Even things that are good, doing well, as well as things that are not doing well, you can identify early. You just hit the roads and see things on your own, kind of a thing. So both kind of authors, I really like to recommend to investors who want to just understand from two perspectives how to look at markets.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Pratik. Thanks for the opportunity, and really happy to be here. Thank you.
Mutual funds are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully. Please consult a financial advisor before making any investment decisions.